This is Sorrel Hillman of Time magazine, about to go into the third of a series of 10 discussions with that distinguished man of letters, John Mason Brown, on the general subject of the humanities. We're going in this talk to consider the role of the artist in society. Can he perform in a vacuum? A favorite word today among the station wagon intelligentsia is engagé, which I at least take it to mean the involvement of the artist with the society in which he lives. Mr. Brown, does the writer feel a moral obligation to participate in the political and social problems of his day?
Mr. Tillman, I don't see today how any writer with a conscience can avoid feeling some guilt about and some responsibility for the times in which he lives. Now, this does not mean that I'm asking him to join up with one particular party or to deliver what used to be called messages in his plays
or give books. The buck to the party of his choice and so on.
That's right. I personally have begun to wish that a message is what a writer would deliver to Gosha and leave with him. But I want to distinguish between participation, or your word, engagé, involvement or participation, and I want to go to the levels of participation. I think, for example, there's a vast difference between being a man interested in mankind and in the general dispassionate picture of society, and another man being merely a sworn slave. There has to be a general concept, a philosophical concept of life, an attitude towards life, I believe, in the major writer, and that comes through.
Two people seem to illustrate the problem perfectly. One is Whitman and the other Poe. Whitman, the completely involved writer. Poe, the writer who, most of the time at least, couldn't care less about the society around him, was simply interested in writing, was the pure writer. Don't you think so?
Poe, certainly if you're speaking of the tales, or if you're speaking of the poems, wrote mainly about a kind of early Chas Adams universe of horrors and the grotesque, and wrote brilliantly and mellifluously about it. If you're talking about him as a critic, no. If you remember, in the Literati, he shows his passionate concern not with social conditions, but with the standards of writing. And he's one of the few critics that ever wrote who dared to quote a passage from Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Macaulay, whoever the writer might be, and then copy-read it and correct it in his own emendation. He had that courage. He cared passionately about writing. But let's go back to society. We're talking about the author in relation to society. Mr. Hillman, there have been, in addition to Poe and Baudelaire and many others, brilliant and glorious artists who have not cared particularly about the society around them, who have lived and been fortunate enough to live in periods or places where they have seemed almost hermetically sealed from the world of their times. I believe in the whole of Jane Austen there is only one mention of Napoleon. I believe that so supreme an essayist as Charles Lamb only referred something like 10 or 15 times in passing to the same Napoleon. In our own times we have had writers, blessed writers, who are what used to be described as pure artists. I think the question is, does an artist lose his purity when he becomes interested in an idea or involved in a cause or a society?
Of course, I suppose the writer of all writers, certainly in the 20th century, who springs to mind whenever we talk about the writer or the artist participating actively in society is George Bernard Shaw. And Shaw, who wrote and talked a great deal of drivel about Shakespeare, I suspect he was envious of him, wrote at one point, and is so quoted in that book as saying, "In company with Shelley, Wagner, and Ibsen, I was a social reformer and doctrinaire, first, last, and all the time. My sensitiveness to social, political, and religious injustices and stupidities was certainly shared by Shakespeare, but as he saw no way out of it, it drove him to a Swiftian pessimism in which he saw man in authority as an angry ape, and finally into a cynicism made bearable by the divine gaiety of genius."
I believe full-heartedly that Shaw, in spite of all his pretended dislike of Shakespeare, had one of the most profound understandings and the truest admiration of Shakespeare of any critic that I know of. One thing that he did resent, what he believed was Shakespeare's social indifference, the very thing that you have touched upon in that quote from Shaw that you read. May I oppose your quote with another? To me, it is one of the most beautiful paragraphs in Shaw. It's from the epistle dedicatory to man and Superman. And Shaw says, speaking for himself, and heaven knows with his special brand of eloquence, this is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. There are many people who would be happy doing nothing, and being that little clod of ailments. Shaw had conscience.
Well, of course, Shaw said everything so well that no wonder that G.K. Chesterton, his great rival, when asked on a lecture tour if he didn't think that Shaw was a coming evil, said, on the contrary, a disappearing pleasure.
The interesting thing is that Chesterton has largely disappeared, and Shaw remains. This is not for an argument about the two men, but performers, but certainly they were not equals.
I agree completely.
And both were excellent performers. Let's come back to the problem at hand, and that is the problem we're discussing, the writer who is involved or engagé. I go back to the party hack. I go back to the question of what is a national menace or of danger. Take, for example, before we begin naming any names, let's take some of the things other than politics, other than political beliefs, or even aesthetic beliefs, that drive men into camps. Let's take that appalling cleavage known as war, which divides nations into enemy camps. What happens to a writer in wartime is another problem. Most writers, being also citizens, and many of them being good citizens, serve their countries during a war. The question is not if they serve in uniform, but if they serve their countries in print, can they not do themselves a disservice from the point of view of their reputations?
Thomas Paine is a good example in the Revolution.
Well, Thomas Paine was never an artist. Thomas Paine was the Milton who could only write the Areopagitica. He was the supreme propagandist of his day. There's no bella pamphleteer, don't misunderstand me. And as an employer of language, he was an admirable performer. But he never pretended to turn from what was the track. Heaven knows for the journalist, there's no such thing as being disengaged if he's a political commentator. But we are now talking about the novelist, the playwright, or the poet, and how far they can become involved. I would like to raise some humble points before coming back to war. I'd like to go back to the Civil War and turn to a group of men that we don't necessarily think of as men who are involved. Unless my memory fails me, there was the New England group who were all in favor of the Underground Railway and did everything they could to help the escaping slaves, and who were for John Brown, that slightly older John Brown. Men such as Longfellow, Whittier, and of course Thoreau. Thoreau was a man, a perfect case in point. He was willing to spend that one night, as someone said, away from Emerson's fireplace. But he was also willing to live in comparative discomfort in the woods to write a book which has given more comfort to people who loved nature and contemplation of the eternal values than any other book to have come out of America. May I now edge back to the war?
Please do.
Mr. Hillman, did you ever read an admirable anthology called Men at War?
I have indeed.
Well, if you remember, this was done by Mr. Ernest Hemingway, a man who himself has been involved in political causes.
And wars.
And wars. He's owned wars and owned beliefs and written brilliantly of them. But in this book, Hemingway was collecting the best war stories of all time, ranging from Homer and the Bible right down to Hemingway. And he was pointing out that this was a book of battle and of suffering that will not tell you how to die. It was addressed to the young in service. But he also contemplated the state of the writer. He discussed World War I. Now you, I am certain, Mr. Hillman, remember and read, as I did, almost all of the books that came out of World War II.
Yes.
I did read most of the books that came out of World War I. And there was a dreadful book that was a national bestseller called Over the Top by Guy Empey. Needless to say, it was proven to be a phony. I don't believe Mr. Empey had ever been near a trench, at least, that had barbed wire near it. Mr. Hemingway then points out that there were very few good books, novels, written about World War I, none that he was able to include by his own standards of writing. He remembered Under Fire by Barbusse, the French novel, as being one of the best of those, and he remembered John Dos Passis's Three Soldiers, but he found himself unwilling to include them because so much that was right and moving under the stress of war emotion when those novels were read had vanished. He then went on to raise a point about the writer who is writing to help one side or the other. And Mr. Hemingway's whole point, of course, has been throughout his career and his practice too, to prove that a writer's job is to tell the truth. Hemingway said, if during a war conditions are such that a writer cannot publish the truth because its publication would do harm to the state, he should write and not publish. If he cannot make a living without publishing, he can work at something else. But if he ever writes something which he knows in his inner self is not true, for no matter what patriotic motives, then he is finished. After the war, the people will have none of him, because he, whose obligation is to tell them the truth, has lied to them, and he will never be at peace with himself because he has deserted his one complete obligation.
Well, I think that's true and very well said. I'm particularly interested that you and Hemingway have mentioned Dos Passos in his famous World War I novel, Three Soldiers, because I think Dos Passos, in his own work, illustrates both the art novelist and the social novelist. In fact, I remember an extremely good essay about Dos Passos by Malcolm Cowley once, in which he said that sometimes reading Dos Passos, you get the feeling that he is two novelists at war with each other, that one of these novelists is a latter-day romantic, an individualist, an aesthete. The other one is a hard-minded realist, a radical historian of the class struggle. And both those qualities, of course, are very apparent in Three Soldiers. And undoubtedly, that's one reason why Three Soldiers is not considered a first-rate novel today.
I agree entirely with you, Mr. Hillman, and I think we could cite many instances of authors who have been two authors living within one.
While we're on the subject of Dos Passos and Cowley, could I simply refer you to Cowley's own definition of the aesthetic, the art novelist, the novelist Dos Passos started out to be. He said that the art novelist considers originality the basic virtue. He considers that society is stupid, hostile, Philistine, and it is a poet's duty and privilege to stay aloof from it. He feels that the poet or the poetic novelist is always misunderstood by the world, and that the writer should write entirely for the glorification of art and remain isolated from the world as such.
I understand these points. I've heard them endlessly, and I know that writing is the first obligation, and if Mr. Hemingway is right, telling the truth in writing to the best of your ability, and as you said, and from your point of view, is an obligation. But I do not understand total withdrawal from life. I want to go back to Shaw just for a moment. In World War I, he agreed in his totally different way with Hemingway. When he found he could not agree with the British government, when he wrote a book against the government and against the Kaiser, when he found that he was being denounced everywhere, Shaw, after doing 2 little one-act plays, stopped writing for the theater. He stopped writing until the war was over, because he felt he could not tell the full truth, and he would not write for the theater until he could tell the truth as he saw it. Now, we were talking about authors who are two authors within themselves. May I offer a more contemporary illustration? May I move back now into the period of depression in the 30s and the period of social protest? One of the most adroit employers of language in this country for purposes of prose and comedy is S.N. Bierman, as a writer of profiles and as a writer of comedies. But Mr. Bierman's only trouble as a comic dramatist was that he was also a man of the highest conscience. If he had been willing to write play after play merely about Long Island or the inanities of cafe society, those plays, I think, would have lasted glitteringly as examples of high comedic writing. But he did have this conscience, and almost always a question was raised in the play that was larger than the domain of laughter, because it was raised in protest and in anger.
Yes, I remember a play, one of his least successful, in which Laurence Olivier and Catherine Cornell appeared, which was really, I suppose, autobiographical in that it was about the playwright who is a successful author of urbane, light drawing-room comedies who hankers to write the really profound, serious play about our times and simply can't do it, and then has all kinds of domestic discord as a result.
Yes, it was successful from a box office point of view. May I turn to another Bierman play, and you could turn to any number of them, they all had these, we'll say 2/3 of them had a Congrevian touch. Only naturally it was Biermann's touch, his personal touch. But then the communists would come in, or then a Jewish character would come in, and then what had been a drawing room flirtation or an infidelity over a weekend suddenly touched upon issues that you could not laugh at, and therefore they died on the vine. That is the truth. Another writer, an American writer of tremendous talents, when his taste can control them, is John Steinbeck. And Steinbeck is someone, it seems to me, who has been torn in his career between what was his social indignation and what was his genuine skill at writing the English language. I could turn to writer after writer who has felt this duality within himself and suffered sometimes because of it.
Of course, I think that the great trouble with the proletarian novel of the 30s is that it lacked the quality of good storytelling that made Charles Dickens propaganda. Nobody was more engagé than Mr. Dickens.
I want to interrupt for a moment, Ms. Tillman. That this difference exists between the 20s and the 30s, and some people are apt to forget it. In the 20s, America discovered that it could produce artists, meaning playwrights, writers, novelists, poets, and those writers discovered that they were discovering themselves. The writers who wrote in the 30s were of a younger generation, and they discovered that America was not what it had promised to be. And that is why they responded to the social protest. The excesses of the plays written by those who had turned in misguided moments into communists were palpable and laughable. You couldn't eat an apple in one of those plays, you had to sell it. If the character didn't have a tin cup in hand, you knew he was the villain. If anyone smoked a cigar that he hadn't picked up off the street, that's the way you knew the person who was hissable.
The fact remains that I suspect that Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, probably the only really distinguished proletarian novel to emerge from that period, will be savored 50 years from now by people who never saw a dust storm and never picked a berry, simply because the Okies that Steinbeck writes about are conveyed so brilliantly, so movingly as human beings, not simply as oppressed symbols. But could I come back just one tiny second to Shaw?
Certainly.
Because I think that one interesting point about most of these artists, regardless of the extent to which they become involved or not involved with their society, is that most of them have a certain arrogance, perhaps arrogance that's essential to the work they're going to do. And when Shaw came to England in the 1870s, I think he worked a few months only for a telephone company, and then did...
It was the Edison Company.
The Edison Company.
Name it.
And then did nothing but write 4 or 5 unreadable, virtually unpublishable novels, and let his mother take care of him. And years after that, this is what Shaw explained about those years, unabashedly. He said, "I did not throw myself into the struggle for life. I threw my mother into it. People wondered at my heartlessness. I steadily wrote my 5 pages a day and made a man of myself at my mother's expense."
He happened to do other things at the same time. It is an American tradition, and he broke this one. This is one of the things he did, that you must always support Ma and Pa. You must always eat Mom's pies, and you must think of nothing else except Mother's Day. Shaw was heartless about that, though he did love his mother. Shaw's first 5 novels were pretty bad, though they're not quite as bad as that. Cashel Byron's Profession is a good one. The very first book, Immaturity, Shaw admitted that the only people who had been able to nibble their way into it at all were the mice and the rats that had gotten through the first 2 pages. But Shaw was not only living off Ma, Shaw was employing his time. It is the American belief that if you have a paying job and are clocked, that you are therefore profitably employed. Shaw gave up the job with the Edison Company because he began to get more money for it than he wanted, just as he had given up a job in Ireland because he had got a promotion. Those were Shavian reasons. But when he was unemployed, he was not, in the technical sense, he was never unemployed personally. He was at the British Museum, a man with an alabaster skin and a pale red beard in those days, sitting with 2 books before him, and this is the double artist, the double writer in one man. On the one hand, as you may remember, was the score of the Nibelungen, and on the other was Das Kapital, and he would turn from one to the other. And Shaw, throughout his whole life, was an artist, was a propagandist, And of course, he was a successful propagandist because he happened to be a supreme artist in spite of himself.
Well, there I agree completely with you. Now to take up somebody who couldn't be more removed from Shaw and from everything that Shaw believed that the artist should do. Of all people, Willa Cather. You remember way back in the 20s, Willa Cather wrote a quite famous essay called The Novel Démeublé, in which she pleaded for throwing furniture out of the novel. And I remember that she asked, are the banking system and the stock exchange worth being written about at all? And her answer was no, because she said they had, quote, no proper place in imaginative art, unquote.
This is again a question of whether you write with Sears Roebuck's eyes, doing a catalog of furniture, or whether you make the furniture a character and include it in the book and make it live. To exile the stock market, the banker, etc., seems to me a very whimsical and lovely idea. I, however, feel about it very much as I do about a famous remark once made by George Jean Nathan, when Nathan found himself sitting, getting a happy salary, and writing happily in his dark room, his David Belasco setting at the Hotel Royalton. He wrote an essay on aesthetics saying, I do not give a fig which army, the German army was sweeping over Belgium, which army moves where, so long as I can sit here and write a book on aesthetics, and he quoted that old line, I do not care who writes the laws of a country so long as I know who writes its songs. Well, that is beautiful, so long as an army is moving to protect you, to keep you safely in the Royalton. And in those days, it was not only an army, there was an ocean, which was still worthy of a navy.
Presumably royalties kept him in the Royalton.
Critical royalties, but they're not the largest, the ones you twinklingly had in mind. But my point is, Nathan himself turned on that statement. He never lived it down and always wished he could, because by the time he had survived the 30s, by the time he had seen World War II come, George Nathan realized that the ivory tower had gone. When I was young, I was brought up in a world, this kind of world Miss Cather was mentioning, in which there still were ivory towers. After World War II, those towers were converted into craters. And very few people who have lived through the period of the craters can go back to the ivory tower, and even the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which someone once said in the war, what a pity they didn't hit it, it's so silly. But it now is leaning further and further to one side. Let's define the argument. I'm not asking for the total commitment, but the emotion and the caring for a principle. There's a vast difference between caring for the Republican or the Democratic Party, as of this year, and of caring for what is the future of the human race under what is the democratic government, small d, as we have it in this country.
Well, of course, what Willa Cather preached, happily, she didn't always practice.
She certainly did
because
not.
in her best books, she left the furniture in. But I think that as a statement of the pure art writer who doesn't want to become at all involved with the life in and around him, I think what she said about getting rid of the furniture is a fairly classic statement, don't you?
Yes, Mr. Hillman, I would agree, but it's a classic statement among many classic statements which have said more or less the same thing. Miss Cather was a perfectionist, just as Jane Austen was. And both of these women were women who did have this sense of withdrawal from what they considered the anti-aesthetic or anti-artistic attributes, confrontations of life. There's a lovely writer from our time for whom the world became too much. This is Virginia Woolf that I'm speaking of. And I think one of the most poignant moments in contemporary letters is when Virginia Woolf, fragile, old, I suppose, by young standards, who had written of beauty and literature and written from her own experimental novels, suddenly found England at war again, and as you remember, she walked out into the back garden and there into the river and drowned.
Yes.
Because the world was what she couldn't take. Now, the writers who are involved, or participants, are people who are eager and willing to face the world. There's no hope for mankind in mass drowning.
Well, let's get back to the 30s, because surely there's no period in which the writer has felt a greater need to participate.
The 30s, of course, gained their vitality from what was the seeping vitality of the nation. As we went into a depression, and as we went into a bank holiday, and as the class of 29 graduated, those young men who had been offered promises found that the world, as I have indicated, wasn't what they had hoped. And then came this protest, the protest of the young and the indignant. I myself find that now, though I despise most of the plays and books written in those years, though I loathe their politics and also loathe their craftsmanship, I look back with a certain nostalgia, at least upon the strength of their convictions.
I mean, simply because they cared at all.
They cared, there was heat, there was indignation, and they were concerned with more than themselves. One of the things that I cannot tolerate in the so-called angry young men is that they have no sense of the outside world, that they only look upon their own little egos and talk without large ideas endlessly upon small subjects.
How do you explain Robert Sherwood, who started out as the drawing room comedic playwright and ended up as the playwright of indignation?
You think of him as a writer of drawing room comedies, but of course he actually started out with The Road to Rome, which is a drawing room comedy in ancient dress. It was a Shavian device to treat ancient history in contemporary idioms. Sherwood wrote from 29 until World War II came, and then he tried to write after World War II, and though he wrote several plays, he did not achieve his former success. Sherwood is to me a fascinating illustration of the man who was both artist and involved. Sherwood was one of the few American dramatists who could write prose as well as dialogue, and I mention this because Mr. George Bernard Shaw could do both. Both Shaw and Sherwood were fond of writing prefaces, and a man who writes a preface to a play that has argument in it and is concerned with large issues is already indicating that he's an artist, because in his preface he is apt to put what he is not able to get into his play or does not want to put in there because it's beyond being dramatized. The summary of Sherwood's shifting views with shifting times can be found, of course, in his review of his own preface to There Shall Be No Night. There Shall Be No Night, as we all remember, was the play that Mr. Sherwood wrote in hot indignation from events that occurred in Finland. He had listened to a broadcast one Christmas. He had listened to young Bill White's broadcast from Helsinki. He was enormously moved by what was happening. He had had in his mind a play about a man who had written a Nobel Prize. Sherwood, who since World War I had been largely thought of as a pacifist, had begun to be thought of, after There Shall Be No Night, as a warmonger. He had thought of writing this play about a Nobel Prize winner, and suddenly he saw the Nobel Prize winner in terms of what was happening in Helsinki. What happens when a civilized man who has done much for mankind, who has loathed war, fought for peace, suddenly discovers that his country is being invaded, that every value he believes in is being destroyed? Mr. Sherwood's answer was the answer that he himself took in the course of his own life. He becomes an actual participant. He turns away from science for the moment to put on uniform, to carry a gun. He cannot stand up against, nor does he wish to stand up against, this huge inundation from outside. Sherwood, I believe, throughout his whole career, wrote from one great theme, and that is the theme that was already stated in The Road to Rome. And that is the conflict in The Road to Rome between the Grecian wife married to a Roman. It's a conflict between the Roman idea and the Greek idea. Mm-hmm. The play that we have not seen over here except produced by amateurs, the key play of Sherwood, is a play called Acropolis, in which the contrast is there drawn between the Spartan point of view and the Athenian point of view. In other words, between the abiding word, the abiding beauty, and between the money that must go to arms. He happened to live in a world which twice found itself almost shriven of its values by the horrors of war. Sherwood was one of the people who went into World War I. He fought as a man 6'6". He fought for the Black Watch because he was too large to get in our army. He had been told by the army that they wouldn't dig trenches that deep. But he fought as an idealist, believing at first in Wilson's summoning phrases. And then came 1919, after Mr. Sherwood had been gassed and wounded 9 times in about 12 hospitals. And when in 1919 the peace treaty failed, due to Mr. Wilson and due to many other factors, Sherwood lost his belief in the plume on the head and the warrior fighting for democracy, and became one of the disillusioned generation. He returned here, bitterly disillusioned. And the interesting thing about Sherwood is he wrote plays such as The Petrified Forest that were anti-war, Idiot's Delight, which was divided between war and peace and entertainment, vaudeville as opposed to horror. But always there was this search for the thing that he had lost. And when World War II came, he felt that this was again civilization, a challenge, and hence urged action and participated himself. I think it's interesting to talk about two writers in one person. Two of Sherwood's most serious prefaces are those to his best-known comedies. The preface to The Road to Rome is a highly scholarly and brilliantly done study of Hannibal. The preface to Reunion in Vienna, which was one of the gayest of comedies, is a heartbroken analysis of what has happened to the individual in the modern world and the hope for that individual. Certainly The Petrified Forest, which symbolically was our civilization, was an expression of his melancholy, though most people think of it now as a gangster play with Humphrey Bogart
yes,
shooting it up. But the plea was there always for peace.
I think that Sherwood is an almost classic example of the dilemma as it's posed within the framework of one man. But do you feel that involved, uninvolved as the case may be, the artist has a right to demand special treatment and privileges from people? Is he more special than the housewife or the businessman or the mechanic?
I certainly think he deserves some consideration. And so far in this country, though everything has been done, at least mechanically, for the housewife, and from a legislative point of view, for any number of industries and businesses, very slowly has our government awakened under any administration to what is the possible function and certainly the national importance of artists.
But don't you also feel that it's a very difficult thing to define the artist? For example, one might write or compose or paint far more brilliantly after 3 martinis. The other one would be helpless after 1 martini. I mean, who can say under these circumstances the artist is nurtured, is well protected, under these others he is not?
I don't want him nurtured. I want him respected. I want him admired if he performs well. The voter is one thing. He comes in large numbers and matters. The artist has to come as one person. He has to be exceptional. And whether he's a participant or not, whether he is engaged or not in the society around him, or in his philosophical hopes, the thing that matters is that when he speaks, he does not ventriloquize for someone else. He has to speak for himself in his own voice in a way that no one else can ever hope to duplicate.
Well, don't you feel that some writers are infinitely more satisfactory when they don't become involved with people, antisocial types like Edna St. Vincent Millay, for example?
Well, she must have been charming, though. I think most writers are more attractive when not seen at all. They're much better on the printed page than they are in person. And I think that is one reason to go back to this man who keeps returning here as if he were the Fuller Brush man of literature. Mr. Shaw, as you know, stubbornly refused to even mix with artists. He said all they want to do is to caress each other's egos. I want to pursue ideas.
Should anyone engaged in what loosely could be called the creative arts, should he be judged differently from the rest of us? Aren't they still people who love or lose, who are rich or poor, who have fun or sulk, and who have to be stood up and counted at the town hall just like any guy paying off a mortgage on a split-level house?
Yes, but presidential elections come once only 4 years, and I'm in favor of the writer or artist voting naturally on election day. But in between times, I do not want him to ring doorbells and necessarily be a party hack. I want him to be himself. And I think his first obligation is naturally to the country, but his inner obligation is to himself.
Well, if the writer's obligation is to himself, then does it really matter at all whether he is involved with the social, intellectual, economic, or political environment about him? Does it matter?
I think the political slant matters a great deal.
Why?
It is the history. It is part of human history to agree with those who agree with us. For example, remember how long it took the British to realize that Gandhi was a great man rather than an eccentric. Remember how long it has taken this country to forgive Ezra Pound, because he happened, as we all remember, to write fascist propaganda in Italy during the war. And that did turn a large public away from him. But that is under the heat of war. I remember Mr. Hillman, oh, let me remember this, because it happens after every war. But I remember after World War I, when the old Lexington Opera House was here, and when the Chicago Opera Company came here to do a season of Wagner, there was a huge demonstration by noble patriots outside of the theater to prove that Wagner was a German, he was a Kraut, and therefore he should not be played. And how much wiser, may I cite, in World War II was the London Philharmonic, when at Coventry, in a ruined auditorium that had been bombed on one of the raids by the Germans, the British brought the London Symphony Orchestra there, and in those ruins played Beethoven, because their proof was that the artist, the greatest art, rises above national frontiers.
Well, I don't dispute that, and I think we all have grown in that respect, but I think that's getting away from our point. I'd like to bring up a couple of women writers, because having been prohibited for so many years from engaging really in any form of life apart from their homes and their families, curiously enough seem to have developed an ability to write fiction without too great a background of actual experience. Now, how do you account, for example, for the Brontes with their amazingly imaginative novels, writing obviously not from a world they knew, but from a...
I would challenge you there. I would say that the home life of the Brontes, with those howling winds around them, with the brother, the father, and that whole landscape, this must have been one of the perfect settings to draw upon for that kind of writing. It was amazing what happened at the Bronte home, where the lightning struck and struck and struck and struck. It was astonishing.
Lightning struck creatively. I don't think the home life was all that ghastly. However, take a better example, Jane Austen. Now, certainly, although Jane Austen wrote entirely about the limited provincial society that she knew so well, also did it with a sophistication that she could hardly have developed from the society around her.
Jane Austen is, to me, as to thousands of Janeites, one of the perfect products of English literature. Within her own field, within her own range, she is perfect. Jane Austen is one of the few writers that every year I go back to and read. Your comment on Jane Austen, it seems to me, depends upon a word you used earlier, and you said, in effect, how can women write as they now do, considering that they have had a somewhat limited experience?
Yes.
I disagree, because the stuffs of the novel are not the experiences of politics necessarily, as Miss Cather pointed out. They may not have to do with finances, though they probably will have more so since women come to own more and more of American wealth. But they can write from the home, from the hearth, from childhood, from love, from disappointment. They can write the small subjects of what, if they have great gifts, they can make large. It isn't the magnitude of a subject, it's the skill with which it is dealt that elevates it to importance in literature. Women have a special equipment for novel writing and for poetry writing, and that is, at least by common hearsay and by ever-repeated tradition, they are blessed with a sensitivity of intuition denied to most men.
So they say, at least.
Well, I think most men discover it sooner or later, happily or unhappily. Look at a page of Austen. Look at a page of Edith Wharton at her best. Look at the Brontes at their best. Look at Willa Cather. Look at any distinguished woman novelist, and you will realize that she has seen the world through extraordinary eyes, and she has not seen those things that a man necessarily would see or probably would ever see. And therefore, her writing gains a special quality because she is a woman.
More to the point of our discussion, people read Jane Austen even if she never did mention Napoleon.
That's the whole point. They read it for her wit, her intuition, and the glory of her language.
If she had written less well, then you would have suggested that she busy herself a bit more with the problems of her day.
No, I'm saying there are two sides to this. I'm happy that Jane Austen did not bother herself with the problems of the day, because there were plenty of people forgotten who were busily writing tracts with dialogue thrown in, political tracts of all kinds. Oh, no, I think her immolation is part of her distinction.
Of course, there are so many people we could bring up, from Thomas Aquinas to Thackeray to Roger Bacon, Leonardo. Oddly enough, the one really outstanding example of the artist able to project himself creatively and at the same time concern himself enormously with the problems of his day was Dickens. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I think he concerned himself almost against his will, because there was a growing concern in Bleak House and Edwin Drood. But he found society so awful that he made his attacks by implication in terms of his hilarious ridicule and overdrawing of people.
Well, I would disagree about Dickens. It seems to me that Dickens distorted his characters because Dickens was unable to write about genuinely believable people in the sense that we, at least today, think of people as being believable, but that the vitality and imagination and the pulse of his writing was so tremendous that it carried him way past the point of actual believability.
Let's drop the word caricature, though I still think it's right, and say he inflated out of this sheer energy. I don't think there is a writer of English novels, to my knowledge, that has ever brought the vitality to writing that Dickens did. It is amazing to me that throughout this whole discussion we have left out one writer and the author of the two greatest novels ever written. I'm speaking of Leo Tolstoy. And Leo Tolstoy, if you will remember, wrote one novel from an event, superlatively, War and Peace. And Anna Karenina is written from the eternal passions against the background of the society without any involvement in a social point of view. Tolstoy's own involvement became greater and greater during his life, and he is one of the perfect examples of the artist finally downed by becoming a reform sinner and then mistaking himself for a saint.
Well, Tolstoy almost went crazy, didn't he, in his last years?
I'm not certain of that. I know from having read his daughter's book and the picture of his last wife's life, anyone would have gone crazy living with Tolstoy. It's perfectly impossible, but the joy of War and Peace and of Anna Karenina, the joys, different as they are, illustrate to me this duality between the great epic rooted in event and between the superb comment on society with a small s.
And ultimately that duality became too much for Tolstoy personally.
Yes.
Well, do you think that Tolstoy himself actually did his books influence his times? Did they influence men's thinking or legislation or what?
I don't think so. I will say this, they influence critics throughout all times, because no one can now write a book that's over 1,000 pages long, whether it's about the Civil War or, and especially if it's about Russia, without being compared to Tolstoy. Tolstoy must spin in his grave endlessly because of all the lesser books that are compared by overgenerous critics to Tolstoy's masterpieces.
Well, James Jones was asked how his novels, some came running compared with Tolstoy's War and Peace, and he thought for a moment and then said, well, it moves more swiftly.
But it goes from here to eternity.
Some of Dickens' novels did actually influence laws on the statute books in England, didn't they?
Books and plays have had direct results upon legislation and upon future history.
I mean, good books.
We all know that Uncle Tom's Cabin is supposed to have been one of the makers of the Civil War, and heaven knows it is a poorly written book of tremendous power. We all know that since the turn of the century that such a man as John Galsworthy, for example, when he wrote a play called Justice, helped change prison reform. There have been a number of instances of where specific legislation has been altered. My point, and let me end on this, my point is that if a writer is writing only about a law that can be changed, or about a particular condition in a society at a particular moment in history which is remediable, then his work loses its life after he has won his victory. The great writers have taken longer objectives. They have faced life, not a law, as a problem. And what they have been is propagandists for the dignity or the suffering of man, or what is the confrontation of life. There are dreams that are left in words that haunt men for years.
Well, Mr. Brown, not for the first time, you leave me with nothing to say. Having said which, I can only say this, that up to this point in our conversations, we have come to grips with some fairly weighty material. So during our next talk, I should like to change the pace a bit and ask you to take up the elusive and complicated and very frequently serious subject of laughter, and to discuss its causes, its anatomy, and some of its uses.